Buenas noches a todas y a todos. Bueno, para nosotros que estamos en Latinoamérica, buenos días para quienes están en Filipinas, en Seúl. Este es un encuentro del Círculo de Epistemologías Decoloniales de la Universidad del Buen Vivir, en el marco de la campaña por un currículum global de la economía social y solidaria. Hola Alejandro, bienvenido.
Hola, ¿se me escucha a mí?
Sí, adelante.
Porque tuve dificultades para poder entrar, no sé si se me escucha o si se me ve.
Te ve y se te escucha, lindo.
Bueno, un cariño a todos. Buenas noches a todos. Buenas noches acá, buenos días para algunos, ¿no?
Así es. Así que estamos por iniciar, estamos en realidad en el mes de mayo. Esta es la conversación que vamos a tener con dos colegas, con dos colaboradores, hermanos de la comunidad asiática, y vamos a estar conversando con ellos, que van a tener media hora de presentación cada uno, y luego habrá 15 minutos para que puedan conversar y que puedan responder preguntas. Y bueno, por supuesto, nos va a acompañar con la traducción Alicia, así que bueno, para todos un saludo enorme, y pueden escribir en el chat las preguntas que quieran, presentarse con lo que ustedes gusten. Les vamos a poner un link, que es un enlace donde los presentadores y las presentadoras, porque esta es la parte asiática, mañana vamos a tener a las 12 del mediodía a Mazda Nir, va a estar Rosy Zúñiga del CEAL, van a estar la gente de Culebrón Timbal, también de Moreno, y Mary Ellis de Estados Unidos. Así que cuando quieras, Fernando.
Muy bien. Entonces comienzo. Ok. Comienzo entonces. Ups. ¿Qué pasa? Se desapareció. ¿Qué pasa? ¿Qué pasa? Se desapareció mi PowerPoint, no se ve. Aquí. Ups,
Ahí.
un momentito.
Porque quedó al final, vos hoy lo presentaste.
Sí. Ok. Ok, muy bien.
Ahí.
Entonces, muy buenos días a todos desde Manila y buenas noches a nuestros colegas y amigos en América. Quisiera comenzar saludando a la cooperativa organizadora internacional de la Universidad del Buen Vivir. Para mí es un honor poder compartir con ustedes algunas ideas, algunas miras. Para decirle la verdad, este tema es bastante nuevo para mí. Soy novato en este tema, pero se aprende participando y actuando. Quisiera hablar del patrimonio como senda hacia el buen vivir. Soy profesor en el estudio del patrimonio cultural en mi universidad. Es lo que conozco. Pero me parece que hay una afinidad natural entre el estudio del patrimonio y el estudio del buen vivir. Como todos sabemos, el buen vivir es una respuesta al desafío capitalista. Entonces mi pregunta es, ¿qué aporta el estudio del patrimonio cultural a su defensa? Estos son mis temas: el desafío capitalista, el patrimonio cultural como senda al buen vivir, y cómo enseñamos el patrimonio cultural como senda posible en el Ateneo de Manila. el desafío capitalista, como todos sabemos, el capitalismo propone un ciclo interminable de producción y consumación. Reduce al individuo a una cifra. No tiene valor en sí. El desarrollo de sus diferentes habilidades no cuentan. Porque sobre todo lo que más vale es la eficacia, más que el disfrute gozoso. Lo que más vale es el tiempo, la rapidez de cambio, en vez de momentos importantes. Y sabemos que en el capitalismo el medio ambiente es solo un instrumento de producción. De la naturaleza se extraen los recursos y a la naturaleza se tira toda la basura. De lo que veo al Buen Vivir es una respuesta porque nos dice que para ser humano tenemos que valorar nuestras relaciones con nosotros mismos, con los socios, con el medio ambiente. Y que para ser realmente un ser humano tenemos que actualizar la plenitud de nuestras habilidades en una comunidad. Y se requiere la contemplación activa para gozar de algo. Entonces se dice que tenemos que saber comer, tenemos que saber bailar, escuchar. Y sobre todo dice que sin la tierra madre no hay vida. Entonces la naturaleza no es solo un objeto, es un sujeto como nosotros. Y más se ve que la naturaleza tiene sus derechos, que estos derechos se pueden defender dentro del marco legal. Ahora, ¿cómo sirve el patrimonio cultural como senda al buen vivir? Me parece que el patrimonio cultural tiene un contenido muy fijo que conduce al aprecio del buen vivir. Y hablaremos de su contenido, sus elementos en el estudio del patrimonio cultural. El patrimonio cultural se refiere a la totalidad de los elementos en el mundo de una sociedad particular que son significativos a los miembros y que mantienen la identidad de tal sociedad. Estos elementos son el paisaje natural, el paisaje cultural, estructuras materiales, artes y artesanías, ritos, juegos y celebraciones, y conocimientos. Para mí, el patrimonio ofrece experiencias concretas, específicas, que cuestionan la narrativa del capitalismo. Entonces despierta al alumno. Voy a dar algunos ejemplos. Por ejemplo, en mi universidad estudiamos las montañas como la montaña, como este volcán, el volcán Mayón, de lo cual tenemos muchos en Filipinas. Es un volcán activo, pero muchas veces los alumnos lo ven solo como algo bello, pero les digo que hay algo más en las montañas y voy a hablar de eso dentro de poco. Y, como paisaje cultural, una nueva categoría en el elenco de la UNESCO, tenemos las terrazas de arroz de Ifugao que descienden desde la cumbre de la montaña como escalera hacia el valle profundo. Aquí la gente cultiva arroz en terrazas, aunque sea una tarea peligrosa, siguen haciéndola. Ahora, ¿cómo paran o frenan el estudio del paisaje cultural y paisaje natural al reto capitalista? El disfrute de una escena o de un momento requiere un tiempo no productivo, un tiempo slow, como diría Carlo Petrini, the slow food movement en Italia. O también como nos dicen los proponentes del città slow en Italia, se requiere tiempo. En cuanto a las montañas, se consideran algunas montañas en Filipinas como hogares de los espíritus ancestrales. Entonces los alumnos aprenden que una montaña es más que una colección de piedras y de lodo. Una montaña tiene un significado muy hondo dentro de la vida de una comunidad. Entonces es un lugar sagrado que no se puede violar. En cuanto a los ifugao, lo que hacen desde el punto de vista capitalista parece una locura porque insisten en labrar las terrazas en vertientes casi verticales para producir un tipo de arroz de poca cantidad. Pero este tipo de arroz para ellos es muy importante porque tiene un sabor, tiene un perfume específico. Y además, este tipo de arroz desempeña un papel muy importante en sus ritos. La vida de los ifugao se centra en la producción del arroz. Es lo que da significado a toda su cosmología. Vamos a otro ejemplo. La artesanía. Demuestro el altar barroco de la iglesia de San Miguel el Arcángel en la iglesia de Argao en Cebu. Y después demuestro un tejido que en Filipinas se llama piña porque viene de las fibras de las hojas de la piña. Otra vez los alumnos empiezan creyendo que solo es la belleza de la que se habla, pero aprenden que una artesanía tradicional fomenta el desarrollo de varias habilidades del individuo, porque el artesano tradicional es muy sensible a las calidades de un material, muy sensible a las calidades de la madera o de la plata o de un metal. Juega con el material mediante todos sus sentidos, no solo el toque y la visión, sino también a veces con su olfato y también con su oído. Es toda una sensibilidad que se requiere para producir un arte vivo. Ahora pasamos al festival. Las fiestas son muy importantes en Filipinas. El sábado pasado se celebró la fiesta de San Isidro Labrador en varios pueblos de Filipinas. Aquí en el pueblo de Lucban, en la provincia de Quezon, tienen esta costumbre de ornar sus domicilios con los frutos del campo, con vegetales, con chiles, con tomates, con frijoles y también con tortillas hechas de arroz. Ahora, es verdad que hay concurso donde las calles más ornadas reciben premio, pero me parece que hay algo más. Una razón por qué los vecinos invierten tanto tiempo es porque les gusta mostrar su creatividad, les gusta cambiar cuentos con sus vecinos cuando hagan los ornamentos. Les gusta apreciar todo el fruto de su labor. Entonces, Las preparaciones para una fiesta requieren tiempo y creatividad que nunca serán monetizadas. Para el capitalismo, todo esta labor es otra locura también. Y han habido algunos políticos filipinos que quieren parar las fiestas como una locura, porque dicen que se podría invertir el dinero en empresas más productivas. Pero gracias a Dios que la gente rehúsa porque aman sus fiestas. Entonces, ¿cómo enseñar el patrimonio cultural? Soy miembro de la Facultad de Sociología y Antropología del Ateneo de Manila University. Tenemos un Cultural Heritage Studies Program. Explico primero el nombre de nuestra universidad. Empezó como un colegio jesuita en Manila durante la época española. Se llamaba el Ateneo de Manila. Era una escuela municipal, pero con el cambio de colonizadores se impuso el inglés. Entonces los jesuitas decidieron retener el nombre de Ateneo de Manila, colocándolo con universidad. Solo porque querían retener esta conexión con el pasado. El fin del programa es producir alumnos que valoran aspectos del patrimonio cultural. Eso es muy importante porque muchos filipinos no valoran el patrimonio cultural. Es la gran tragedia porque creen que no hay nada de valor en su pasado, porque creen que Filipinas perdió su identidad por la influencia española y sobre todo por la influencia estadounidense. Pero se despiertan. Al fin del curso tienen que someter un tesis obligatorio. Tienen que explorar un tema particular relacionado al patrimonio cultural. Pero hay problemas porque el contexto actual nuestro es una economía capitalista, donde todo se debería justificar como una forma de desarrollo. Entonces, ¿cómo justificar el estudio del patrimonio? No siempre se conecta con temas de desarrollo. Hay dos cursos que forman el corazón del Cultural Heritage Studies Program. Uno es el Introduction to Cultural Heritage, Introducción al Patrimonio Cultural. El otro es Culture and the Senses, la cultura y los sentidos. En el primero, lo que hacemos es introducir las varias formas de patrimonio cultural y demostrar la relevancia del patrimonio cultural a varios temas. Uno de ellos es la protección del medio ambiente. Para que los alumnos tengan un aprecio más vivo, tenemos proyectos colaborativos. Por ejemplo, un equipo de alumnos colabora con una experta en la promoción de tejidos tradicionales durante precisamente esta pandemia. Otro equipo colabora en el desarrollo de un logo, un emblema para granjas que conservan el terroir o terruño de un tipo de cacao. Por ejemplo, Dita Sandico Ong es una experta que trata de promover los tejidos de grupos indígenas de las montañas de la isla de Mindoro. Aquí se ven sus tejidos en forma geométrica. Estas señoras dependen mucho de la promoción de sus tejidos porque les dan dinero para sus víveres. Ha sido muy difícil promover estos tejidos durante esta pandemia, pero Dita Sandico aún trata de hacer todo lo que es posible. Y mis alumnos, por ejemplo, un grupo, o para ser más preciso, un equipo de alumnos le ayuda en promover estos tejidos. Al mismo tiempo, los alumnos llegan a apreciar la creatividad de la gente indígena de Filipinas. Otro equipo desde Manila, usando estos medios electrónicos, ayuda en promover un tipo de cacao que crece en la ladera del monte Apo en la isla de Mindanao. Recibimos el cacao de México, pero hemos desarrollado tipos locales. Y ahora en este mundo que aprecia el terroir o terruño, siempre hay estos expertos en chocolate que buscan un sabor particular, un sabor que introduce todo un nuevo territorio en el planeta. La experta que nos ayuda en esto es Estela Duque, un chocolatier basada en Londres. El otro curso es la cultura y los sentidos. Aquí el alumno descubre que casi cada uno de los 5 sentidos tiene una gramática que es menester entender para disfrutar de un producto en el encuentro contemplativo. Entonces, este curso, más que el primero, introduce la idea de ser slow, de dedicar tiempo a la contemplación. Al mismo tiempo, este curso explora la posibilidad de que exista un estilo filipino en la esfera de cada sentido. Tenemos varios proyectos colaborativos. Uno de ellos es un equipo de alumnos que colabora con una experta cada año. Organizan una cena preparada por un chef. El año pasado, la cena fue entregada al domicilio de cada participante mediante el Grab. Y después, el menú mismo muestra que algunos granos de tubérculos son alternativas a la escasez de agua en esta crisis planetaria y presentan alternativas vegetarianas a la carne. Y termina con una conferencia por un experto sobre un tema de gran relevancia. Este es el menú que han hecho. Hay 4 cursos. El primer curso compara el quinilao con la ceviche. El quinilao y la ceviche también tienen estas particularidades. El alimento se prepara no con fuego, sino con un ingrediente agrio. El quinilao en Filipinas usa el vinagre, o si no, el jugo de un citrón. Y esto se compara con la ceviche del Perú. El segundo curso compara el uso del maíz en Filipinas con el uso del maíz en México. Maíz es una sopa filipina que usa el maíz con almejas y se compara con el pozole mexicano. El tercer plato busca una alternativa vegetariana a la carne. Entonces, un plato tradicional en Filipinas que usa el cerdo se convierte en algo vegetariano usando la yaca, porque las fibras de la yaca se asemejan a las fibras de la carne del cerdo. Y se compara con un curry del Caribe. Y para terminar, tenemos una torta de cassava o mandioca comparada con unos buñuelos de yuca. Después de la cena, el año pasado, este marzo, tuvimos como experto el doctor Fabián Dairit, que habló de cómo el aceite de coco podría combatir los efectos del virus del COVID. Entonces, lo que el curso ofrece son experiencias concretas que despiertan al alumno, pero se necesita este curso una filosofía. Me parece que la filosofía bien podría venir de la filosofía del buen vivir, summa causai, que en filipino sería maginhawang pamumuhay, es decir, una manera de vivir donde el individuo está relacionado con sí mismo, relacionado con sus socios, relacionado con el medio ambiente. Y con esto termino mi ponencia haciendo un homenaje a Pachamama, a Gaia, a la Tierra Madre. Gracias. Podría hacer un resumen en inglés. What I just said was this. In the Philippines, we have this course on cultural heritage studies. Originally, I had no inkling that I could connect it with Buen Vivir, because the original purpose of the course, which we have had for 20 years, was really to make our students aware of the cultural heritage of the Philippines, which many students are ignorant about because they imagine that our culture has been completely wiped out by Spanish and American influence. But actually the course makes them realize that Filipinos have been quite creative. So cultural heritage studies program in any part of the world usually has the following content. Landscapes, natural landscape. In the case of the Philippines, a new type of landscape, cultural landscape, which has been recognized by UNESCO. Then movable arts and crafts, non-movable structures, celebrations such as rituals and games, and knowledge. The great thing about cultural heritage is it offers concrete experiences that awaken the student, that make the student realize that in fact, there are other ways of looking the world other than the way proposed by capitalism. So for example, they discover that a mountain like Mayon volcano, maybe it's not only beautiful, it's actually the place where the ancestors are supposed to live according to popular belief in a community. So therefore a mountain is sacred. They also discover that there are people like the Ifugao who invest so much time in agricultural pursuits that seem crazy because the pursuits yield a low harvest of rice, and the pursuit is even dangerous because it's done on the side of a mountain, but they do it because the meaningfulness of their culture depends entirely on the rice that they produce. The student was also introduced, for example, to festivals. And festivals in the Philippines are so meaningful because they unite the community together. At the same time, they become a venue for the creativity of the members of the community. So I showed them, for example, videos on the festival of San Isidro Labrador, Saint Isidore the farmer, that's celebrated throughout the Philippines. And then they discovered that arts and crafts like Baroque images or embroidery require a lot of time, but people like to do them because, again, this enables them to express the fullness of their personality in different ways using their different senses. At the same time, they get to play with a material, a specific material, whether it be wood or metal or or gold or silver. So the course is actually, the Cultural Heritage Studies program has actually 2 core courses, Introduction to Cultural Heritage and Culture and the Senses. Introduction to Cultural Heritage gives the student the entire gamut of different aspects of heritage. At the same time, there are collaborative ventures that have initiated. One is a venture that promotes indigenous textiles in Manila. Another one is a venture that tries to play up the importance of a specific type of cacao coming from a specific terroir in the island of Mindanao. The Culture and the Senses course is aimed at awakening the different senses of the students, make them realize that almost every sense has a grammar that is important to discover. And here, an important project is for them to organize a dinner towards the end of the semester. A dinner in contrasts, where a Filipino dish is contrasted with a foreign dish. So they appreciate the originality of the Filipino. At the same time, the dinner for the past 3 years is now focused also on showing that there are alternatives to meat, and also that there are grains and root crops that we should encourage because of the water shortages that we're now beginning to experience. So I would like to end, as I said, with a homage to Pachamama, to Gaia, to Mother Earth. Thank you. Gracias.
Gracias, Fernando, por esta presentación hermosa. Hay varios mensajes para vos. Luciana Ballestero dice, hermosa experiencia del aprender haciendo a nivel universitario y súper potente como modo de concientización sobre la relación del sujeto con la propia cultura y el respeto por el medio ambiente.
Sí.
También hay una pregunta relacionada con el proceso pedagógico que realizás respecto a la concientización de las lenguas originarias y el valor cultural para el buen vivir. Y la otra pregunta es, ¿cuál va a ser el camino que vas a seguir en la Universidad del Buen Vivir, teniendo como concepción desde la cultura oriental, que el Sumaca Usay y el Sumaca Maña también están en otros países y en otros continentes?
No entiendo la primera pregunta, pero entiendo la segunda pregunta. Si tenemos que usar las lenguas indígenas, este es el gran problema mío en Ateneo, porque los alumnos creen que solo pueden explicarse en inglés, pero les digo siempre que hay que usar tu propia lengua vernacular, donde crecisteis, porque es importante poder expresarse en una lengua vernacular, porque tenemos que comunicarnos con la gente ordinaria. El inglés no se puede emplear comunicando con la gente ordinaria. Entonces, les animo a expresarse en Tagalog, que es el idioma más hablado, y también en cebuano, otro idioma más hablado. Tenemos que reconceptualizar qué es el patrimonio y también qué es el buen vivir dentro del marco vernacular. Eso es muy importante. Ahora, ¿qué es la primera pregunta?
La primera pregunta tenía que ver con la relación que hay entre las lenguas originarias y el buen vivir, y la importancia que tiene eso para las economías alternativas.
Sí, me parece que tenemos pues que explorar la relación entre lenguas autóctonas y los conceptos del buen vivir. En el caso del Tagalog, que es la lengua vernacular que hablo, he notado que la expresión maginhawang pamumuhay traduce bien el concepto del summa causae, porque articula más o menos esas tres relaciones con el sí mismo, con los socios y con el medio ambiente. Todo eso está las tres relaciones están en esa expresión, maginhawang pamumuhay. Estar tranquilo, estar contento. ¿Qué es la tercera pregunta?
Acá hay una pregunta de Gustavo Álvarez, dice, muy interesante el planteamiento, mi pregunta es si acaso se conoce la categoría memoria biocultural que en México ha desarrollado Víctor Toledo, pues me parece que podría enriquecer aún más la transformación del paradigma del desarrollo más allá de la categoría patrimonio.
Sí, bueno, esta es nueva frontera para mí, para decirle la verdad. Es todo lo que puedo decir. Tenemos que ir más allá del patrimonio. Sí.
Amalia Paredes también dice, en México retomamos el paradigma de la bioculturalidad, entonces defendemos el patrimonio biocultural y retomamos la memoria biocultural.
Sí, el patrimonio biocultural es importante. Bueno, han habido algunos estudios, ya, por ejemplo, sobre la botánica indígena de grupos particulares, pero tenemos que hacer más. Tenemos que hacer más. En eso es muy importante la obra de antropólogos, porque viven con una comunidad particular y pueden notar. Por ejemplo, el antropólogo Robert Fox hizo un estudio sobre la botánica de los negritos del monte Pinatubo. Yo con mis alumnos, por ejemplo, en la isla de Panay, hicimos un estudio sobre cómo categorizan las plantas del medio entorno. ¿Qué son las plantas medicinales que encuentran?
Y una pregunta que nosotros venimos haciendo con Alejandro, con Alicia, con Marta, Silvia, hacemos a cada uno de los que hacen una presentación en la Universidad del Buen Vivir, es cómo podemos hacer para seguir tejiendo, para seguir caminando en el marco del buen vivir, en este diálogo entre continentes, porque el buen vivir no es solamente una propuesta de vida desde Latinoamérica, sino que es para todo el mundo.
Me parece que manteniendo la conversación es muy importante, porque de lo que he visto, el buen vivir es una conversación que se inició, pero es una conversación en evolución. Entonces, mantener la conversación es muy, muy importante.
Muchas gracias, Fernando. Podemos pasar ahora, si alguien tiene alguna pregunta más para hacer. Alejandro, si querés hacer algún aporte, si querés hacer alguna reflexión.
No, me quedé pensando en cosas que dijo, lo que explicaba del cultivo del arroz en las terrazas y esas cosas. Me quedé pensando, no tengo más, tengo que elaborar más para antes de hacerle alguna pregunta, así que para qué voy a complicar las cosas. No, muy bueno todo, pero bueno, dejó muchos interrogantes que ya habrá oportunidades para ir.
Gracias, Alejandro.
Uno los va pensando y los va relacionando con cosas de otros lados y las propias experiencias. Eso, no, nada más.
Pasamos entonces con Alicia, que va a presentar al profesor Kevin Kester. Así que adelante, Alicia.
Muy bien.
Ya. Sí. ¿En castellano, Claudia?
En
¿Sí?
inglés.
¿Lo presento en inglés?
Claro.
Ok. No terminé el concepto. Bueno, Kevin Kester, here. Where is he? I can see him. Let's see. Ah, here it is. Okay, hello. Well, Kevin Kester is, in this very moment, professor in South Korea. He's has just started, as far as I know, so you correct me, Kevin, a new position as it is not a chant professor, isn't it? It is like having the position that he gained in a contest in the university. And as you can imagine, that it is quite difficult for a young professor as Kevin, and also for a foreign professor to be part of a national university. I am explaining my feelings, but also my thinking on this. That so here we find a young, very, very committed student, that now it is a young, very, very committed professor, that his main field is peace education, as far as I know. Now I'm going to hear from him what specific items or fields of peace education he is searching in this very moment and working on them. I think I know, but I'm eager to hear about it. And so I'm very proud as well to present Kevin, because I know him from 10 years ago, more or less, I would say. And he was quite young, quite shy, very quiet student, eager to study and to learn, and eager to hear what the others said, more than say what he wants to say. So it was a time that he was always in a way closed and just observing the world. That it is exactly what Paulo Freire, the famous Brazilian pedagogist, said. So first you have to observe the world in order to learn how to study the world and to make alternatives to that world. So congratulations to Kevin in order to start that path and to continue doing. Thank you, Kevin, to be here. I'm very, very glad.
Thank you, Alicia. And thank you, Claudia, and everyone else for the very kind invitation. I think Alicia couldn't introduce it better than with the word student. And in part, it's from Freire's thinking, definitely, that I borrow. But it's also from Alicia's work and from Betty Reardon's work that I borrow. And this idea of an edu-learner, of a lifelong student who is continuing to learn from those that he or she engages with. And when I came this morning, I wasn't really sure what to expect, to be honest. But I came with this notion, like Alicia said, of learning from those who are involved in this group on a dialogue of alternative epistemologies, and to try to learn from you toward practices toward ways of enhancing the practices that I'm engaged in. And so I am here hopefully to have a conversation and a dialogue with everyone. So with that, I'm really looking forward to this. I don't have a PowerPoint that I'm going to be sharing, but I will be sharing some insights from recent research studies that I've been doing, and I'll give some ideas around that. So as Alicia said, I'm a young professor in the Global Education Cooperation Program is the name of our program. And we're in the Department of Education at Seoul National University. And what I have done since I've been here is to establish a new research center, and I call it the Education, Conflict, and Peace Lab. It's very much drawn from a sort of natural sciences perspective on creating a community of scholars who work together on a similar issue and trying to establish that research group around the very important topics of education and conflict. And in our lab, currently we have about 12 students that I'm overseeing, and a number of different research assistants who are working on various projects. But we examined 3 different areas, and these relate to peace and peace education. And the first area that we examine is how conflict affects educational access and provision. And then we look at the opposite of this. So the way that education is exacerbating or mitigating conflict. So what's the responsibility of education and educators in perpetuating the forms of violence that we see in society, or in using our educational practices to mitigate these? Now, clearly here, capitalism is one of these core problems that we have today to be addressed through various practices, and that is exactly what this group does, as I understand. And then the third area that we try to do is, given these problems of conflict affecting education, and then education perhaps perpetuating or resolving different forms of conflict, what are transformative responses that we can have as practitioners to promote peace or conflict? So those are the 3 areas that we look at. My recent work has drawn primarily from people like Boaventura de Sousa Santos or Walter Mignolo or others around epistemologies or diverse epistemologies. And so it's very much grounded in what I would think of as epistemic violence or epistemic justice. So I appreciate very much learning from Professor Zialcita this morning about the idea of cultural landscapes and engaging our students with nature and in grounded in the land. It's a provocation that many decolonial scholars have raised, that decolonialism is not a metaphor. And so the importance to engage ourselves in the land and in the cultural heritage of the place is very paramount. However, as Alicia introduced in the introduction for me, I'm clearly not Korean. I didn't grow up in Korea. And so I'm an international educator working in a context in which I'm becoming more and more familiar, but of which the land itself doesn't have the sort of resonance for me as it might for my participants. And this raises the question for me about my ontological security or insecurities. And so how do I, as an educator who is transgressing boundaries, how does that change the sort of way, the worldviews that I have and the ways that I think about knowledge production? So around this, I'm going to talk about a project that I have going in examining peace and peace education. So in recent years, decolonization has become an important intellectual project in higher education as a response to the violences of modernity and the overrepresentation of the Western white male in academia. And as a field of study, peace education is not exempt from this. One scholar named Victoria Fontan, she claims that peace education often constitutes a peace industry that serves to uncritically infantilize the global South and the global East as areas in need of help from Western and Northern white peace missionaries. She explains that this perspective implicates the good work of peace scholars as an instrument of neo-colonialism. Now, as we all know, this neo-colonial order comes with devastating consequences, not only in terms of the delegitimization of non-Western knowledges, but also in relation to the marginalization of non-Western faculty and students at both material and psychic levels. So what this project that I'm speaking about has been attempting to do is to compare the ideas, the concepts of peace education and peace in English. So what do we find within the broader English literatures, but also what do we find within Korean literature? And so in doing this, we're trying to understand the claim, to better understand the claim that the field of peace education is colonized. And so I'm asking questions such as, in what ways and toward what effects might peace education practices in Korea in particular be neo-colonial? How might Korean practices instead inform Western approaches? And what policy responses could support decolonizing peace and peace education in Korea? To do this, I'm drawing off of a number of different scholars from the field of comparative and international education, which is a field that, interestingly, this year at our annual conference, which happened about 3 weeks ago in the US, had a series of 13 different panels on precisely the topic of socialism for the 21st century. And so examining these ills of capitalism, of patriarchy, of colonialism, and then questioning what socialism today might provide for us as ways out of these problems. Now, the scholars in this field that I'm working with at the moment are Anderson, Levitt, and Chiraco. I'm working with their ideas, not with them as co-authors, but with their ideas on comparative literature reviews. And so looking across the linguistic and cultural boundaries of the literature toward what we might learn when we examine something in a domestic or across those cultural and epistemic boundaries. I do this through the lens of decolonial thinking. And I'm attempting to highlight the need to identify and dismantle modernity and coloniality within peace and peace education. And our analyses in this work confirm the claims that colonial ideology is reproduced in between Korean and English higher education settings. But that such cultural reproduction is messy, it's not straightforward. And in the end, the primary contribution that we're offering is providing insights into peace education beyond national linguistic and cultural boundaries, or what Benedict Anderson refers to as imagined communities. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the Korean context and the challenges that we face here. And then I'll offer some of the discussion points that come out of this study before I go to a second study that presents really practical steps that university educators might take toward disrupting coloniality in our institutions. So the Korean context it's quite dynamic in terms of the social, economic, and political changes that have happened in the past 60 to 70 years, but it bridges together what we might call a mid-power state of South Korea that has aspirations toward being a global leader in OECD, in the G20, and bridging together this sort of state that is seeking global legitimacy and global sort of a good citizen in the international arena, alongside the North Korean state that largely avoids internationalism altogether. with exceptions of its very close tie with China. So since the end of the World War II, the status of peace and peace education on the peninsula then has really been dictated by three primary factors. First, the militaristic geopolitical posturing of both of the Koreas, which dominates domestic and international politics. And it materially is affecting the North Koreans who come into South Korean society and the responses of South Korean society toward the acceptance of refugees, not only from North Korea, but from elsewhere as well. Second, the miraculous economic rise of South Korea, which is juxtaposed against the stagnation of the North. And here we see not only the legacy of the Cold War, but we see these two ideas batting together continually between a liberal democratic and capitalist society and alternative modes of economic organization. And the challenges this poses when they sit side by side toward essentializing the ideas of the other. And then third, there's a demographic shift that's taking place currently in South Korea that is drastically shifting the landscape of society. There's a declining birth rate among Korean citizens and an increase of internationals who are coming into the country. So it necessitates a change in the approaches that we take toward the way that we teach. Now, within this broader context, negative peace has mostly prevailed. That is, there's mostly an absence of armed violence and war. However, as I say that, in a recent research study that I'm doing in Afghanistan and Somalia, we actually find a lot more similarities than we might expect. And part of the issue is that South Korea and the North do still have flourishes of direct violence. In 2010, the North bombed a South Korean island. The North also sank a South Korean submarine. And just last year, there was the North Korean soldiers killed a South Korean official. So it's primarily a setting of negative peace, but there are still the very real Cold War threats that exist here. So in this context then, what peace and peace education on the peninsula means is that we focus on issues of militarization, of bullying, of denuclearization, of social justice. And I must also mention Japan here and the colonial legacies that the Japanese imperial state left and that remain a challenge for the way that that those who are working in this context relate, particularly toward Japan, but also toward their other sort of Asian neighbors. So there's a very raw and traumatic experience of colonialism that persists in this context. So then what it means for me and my students as an educator then, as we develop the lab and as we nurture our program, is that decolonial thinking offers us a very unique lens through which to examine these problems of the colonial legacies, of militarism, of patriarchy. And it highlights for us two things. First, the need to resist Eurocentrism and to recognize the contributions of colonized populations in Korea and beyond. And secondly, the moral imperative this brings for us for righting the wrongs of colonial domination. So in this decolonial and post-colonial framework, we're probing historically and culturally the global politics of knowledge production in particular, and the ways of knowing across the world how they are mediated through academia. And we draw off of people like Raewyn Connell and her work on Southern theory. And in that work, she provokes us to look towards the theoretical lenses that we're using to make sense of the world, and really calls for academics to use Southern theory, to utilize Southern theory in more deep and intense ways. And so we've taken it upon ourselves in the lab and in our program to try to listen more toward these decolonial and Southern perspectives, and to integrate them as much as possible into our teaching and into the practice of our research that we're doing. So I'll offer some discussion points around these issues. Yeah, is there a question?
Yeah, do you want to, Kevin, do you want people to ask questions to you now in this very moment? Or after?
I think maybe after.
Okay.
After. So I'll go through very quickly these sort of discussion points, and then I want to speak really pragmatically toward the approaches that educators are using in this context that might be useful elsewhere. So Western centricity in peace and peace education is manifest often when it's promoted through models of liberal peace building that assume democracy, capitalism, individual human rights, and international law alone to be the universal foundations of a just world peace. This liberal peace building model is realized in educational encounters that uncritically promote democratic learning and interactive methods of participation, voice, and problem solving as fundamental to solving issues of violence and peace building. In the field of peace and peace education, this premise is almost hegemonic, where there's a posited correspondence between democratic practices in the classroom and social democracy at large, where voice and choice in education is equated with freedom and capitalism in the political sphere, and where classroom responsibility undergirds active citizenship. Now, it's not to say that these are not important. And indeed, these practices are core to positive peace. But our argument is that they are insufficient alone for a just, global, and inclusive peace-building education. Liberal peace-building education needs to be better understood as only one approach and problematized rather than the only approach. And so we really want to contest the hegemonic position that it has within this work. A related issue that we find when we examine the literature in this field is the prevalence of problem-solving models or interventions. And it's critically argued here that these methods are largely based on Western, linear, and rational thinking models. So a number of different Korean scholars critically reflect on non-Western scholarship as a conveyor belt of Western knowledge within prevailing Western centrism prevails. So here we are suggesting that there are possibilities for reimagining the methods of peace building and democracy from non-Western ontological positions. So one scholar explains that Western problem-solving methodologies are not universally applicable. So sensitivity needs to be employed to avoid furthering the imposition of Western thought in and through peace education in diverse contexts. We've considered here using a trans-rational approach that, like Professor Zialcita explains, the emotions and feelings become paramount to the work that we were doing as we begin to understand rationality as important, but not as the singular way to make sense of the world. And practically this involves things like embodied learning, contemplative practices, and theater. Okay, now we learned a lot through this project toward the sort of legacies of coloniality that continue within our very important field. But we also learned that the challenges and critiques of Western centricity themselves are insufficient to understand the tremendous complexity that Gudmundur Bambara calls connected sociologies, in which Bambara is indicating the ways that the West and East and North and South exist within each other. So indeed, contemporary practices in our field are neither wholly Western, Northern, Eastern, or Southern. And thus, a critique of Western modernity is also a critique of modernity in and from other regions. So I think that was a really important point for us to avoid both essentializing, but also uncritically accepting local approaches simply because they are local. And examining the ways that coloniality is reproduced within this context, not racially, but economically and through a gendered lens as well. So those are discussion points from that project. But before I finish, what I want to indicate in a research project with Korean university educators, we tried to identify what are the modalities that they're already using. So again, remember, Alicia started this session by introducing me as a student. And methodologically, we used a participatory action research approach in the same way for us as researchers to learn from the educators practicing in Korea toward what they already do. Not an intervention model to say, this is decolonial thinking, this is epistemic justice, and here are the answers, you do this, but rather as scholars and academics, using a lens of decoloniality to step back and try to embrace and learn from what our participants had to say to us. And they offered us, in a reflexive manner, they offered us 6 different approaches that they used to try to overcome the decoloniality. First, they talked about onto-epistemic changes. So these were the changes in mindset that they highlighted as foundational for everything else that was to follow. So for example, bracketing capitalism, putting capitalism to the side, pausing to think about speed and in Korean society, bali. Everything's very fast. So putting that to the side and being reflective, being contemplative, looking toward the essence of our practices, why we're doing what we're doing. And so they highlighted this importance of an onto-epistemic change as the foundational step towards moving in a decolonial direction. And then they opened up curricular changes that they spoke about with us. So would include, for example, going back to the earlier points from Raywon Kano and De Sousa Santos to integrate different perspectives from the Global South, but also different theories from the Global South into our core theoretical courses and into the reading materials that we're giving to our students. And so these educators highlighted this point. They also highlighted the challenges for them to do this, but highlighted this as a very fruitful possibility. They then spoke about pedagogic responses that they use to try to model decolonial practices in their class. Here, again, as Alicia said in the beginning, Paulo Freire became a very important model for these scholars in terms of their pedagogic practices that they perceived to be embracing of epistemic justice. Then they spoke of methodological tweaks and the sort of approaches we might use as researchers, such as participatory action research, where our participants become engaged in the research with us in order to identify the problems that they want to address and to practice it in a holistic and in a relational manner that is respectful. They went on to discuss institutional policies, and so the ways that our institutions could disrupt the logic of colonialism and capitalism in the institutions, such as an obsession with particular metrics of output among academics. And then finally, they discussed scholarly practices as well in terms of utilizing those different theoretical frameworks that they might in their research. So these were 6 different approaches that came from the educators themselves that we found to be very fruitful for our practices here and are trying to implement into the lab and into what we're doing in our global education cooperation program with our students. And it takes us back full circle to the values that Professor Zialcita spoke about in terms of solidarity, in terms of environmental stewardship, slowing things down, a focus on feelings and emotions and participatory pedagogies and interactive pedagogies. So I again appreciate you inviting me here to listen to your ideas and to contribute to this discussion on decolonial epistemologies. Thank you very much.
Finalmente, Kevin agradece en la última frase haberlo invitado, haber podido intercambiar sus ideas y espera pues comentarios con respecto a su presentación en lo que se refiere a metodologías decoloniales.
Fíjate, Alicia, que Alejandro hizo una pregunta en el chat.
Yo estoy tan concentrada haciendo la traducción que no era fácil, entre paréntesis. Una pregunta, Alejandro, no la encuentro. ¿Está muy arriba?
Dice, habla de cambio de una epistemología al interior de la ciencia, o de diálogos de saberes.
Tiene que decir de Alejandro, espera.
Decoloniales.
Estoy buscando la pregunta, no la encuentro. Alejandro, decíla otra vez a la pregunta si la traduzco, porque no la encuentro en el chat. De Alejandro a todos, así. Habla de cambio de una epistemología al interior de la ciencia y de diálogos de saber y de epistemología de
una pregunta. Es una pregunta, porque yo me voy guiando por lo que van traduciendo.
Sí, claro.
Y él está pensando a nivel epistemológico. Entonces yo pregunto, digo, o lo planteo porque no...
Decime la pregunta claramente para que la pueda traducir.
Entonces, la preocupación epistemológica es al interior del campo de la academia, de la ciencia, o están hablando de un diálogo de saberes y de epistemologías decoloniales como las vemos nosotros de las epistemologías del sur. O sea, ¿cuál es la mirada epistemológica? O sea, ¿cuál es la pregunta epistemológica que se están haciendo?
Eso es lo que querés que le pregunte, ¿sí? Bien. Kevin.
Y por lo que vengo leyendo al lado.
Sí. Let's see, where is he? Here. Kevin, do you hear me?
I hear you, yeah.
Okay. Well, Alejandro is a professor, Alejandro Tombesi, and so an Argentinian one, a good fellow, by the way. Well, Alejandro is asking you about the epistemologies. And so he's asking if your description of the epistemologies that you are trying to use and to apply, etc., and to follow, is the same idea of the epistemologies of the South, what we say today, in order to criticize the colonialism, etc., or what kind of proposals are you describing? Because he thinks that it is similar to what we call the epistemologies of the South. That is why. Okay? Do you understand the question? Yeah.
I think so, yeah. So when Alejandro was asking the question, I think I understood it sort of as Alejandro offered two different ideas. One as alternative epistemologies, and the other, Alejandro, I think you had another sort of comparison point that you were looking at. And so I don't have the translation here at the moment, but I'll come back to it, but I was curious of how you were positioning those two different sort of ways of looking at this decolonial work to help me understand both how you're thinking about it and how to respond. But what I would say, Alicia, in terms of epistemologies of the South, again, so there are different scholars that I'm drawing off of to try to understand this. De Sousa Santos' Epistemologies of the South is one of them. And so grounded very much in the Latin American experience of trying to, to think through things differently from a standpoint that isn't Eurocentric, that embraces the experiences of the populations of Latin America and the ways that these experiences would inform intellectual thinking in a way that is distant or different from if we do it, for example, through English or do it through example from an Anglophonic sort of centric viewpoint. So one of them is from this notion of epistemologies of the South, certainly, but I also referenced Raewyn Connell and Connell's approach from Australia, which similarly is looking at the indigenous perspectives of Australians in that context, First Nations, but as well towards Iranian and African scholars and those in other regions of the world of what their experiences and intellectual thinking might offer toward contesting the ideas that we are familiar with from within Eurocentric academia. So one of the issues that we have as we look at these is how they're geographically confined. And so many of the ideas from De Sousa Santos, who I realize is not Latin American, but from De Sousa Santos from Portugal, and then from many of the other Latin American scholars like Anibal Quijano, and their insights into these practices are very much confined within that sort of geographical region. And then Raewyn Connell's ideas coming from other regions around the world, although Connell herself, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is also white European. And then, although she brings a very interesting gender lens into it that contests patriarchy. And then, and here in Asia, a scholar named Quan-Xing Chen, who's from Taiwan, and who has argued for Asia as method, I think to a very large degree, borrowing from or in parallel with a lot of the arguments that were coming out of Latin America toward imagining alternative epistemologies. And his argument is toward thinking of Asia not as a geographical entity, but thinking of Asia as a way of seeing the world from within. And so I think Chen really challenges us to go beyond, well, again, to challenge the idea of area studies and to really try to embrace what Asian knowledge might be and what Asian experience might do toward contesting or expanding beyond the sort of Eurocentric standpoints.
Kevin,
so,
wait a minute, because perhaps it helps to your answer what Alejandro is adding. Alejandro said, as all of us said in Latin America, that when we say epistemologies of the South, it doesn't mean our South. It means all of us. And here Alejandro said, when I talk about Latin America, I mean the periphery. So the periphery. He tried to say that the epistemology of the South doesn't mean only Latin America, of course, for us.
Clearly, I understand this. It's not north-south in a geographical sense. Of north means above, the equator, and south means below the equator, some generic sort of arbitrary line like that. For sure, I understand this, and that's my point earlier about the importance of the South and the North and the South, all of these things. But I don't think we can divorce, and I think it would be dangerous for us to divorce. And in fact, I think that the theories that we're drawing off of right now would not divorce the importance of the geographical positioning and the ontological positioning where we are. So it's still important for me to understand that many of these narratives, they were coming from the peripheral, as Alejandra is saying. So De Sousa Santos calls Portugal the peripheral of Europe. And I think it's quite a contested idea that he brings that up. But also the peripheral experience of what was taking place within Latin America during this rise of capitalism across the North. And so while I understand that South does not mean the geographical location of a particular country or place, I think that still that ontological space where we've lived and experienced it is important toward informing the way that we think about these issues. And so for me, that's the point, is as we're drawing off of alternative theories, it's important for us not just to take from Latin Americanists who are informing our sort of decolonial thinking, but also to look toward the decolonial thinking of African scholars and of South Asian scholars. And so it's an attempt to democratize or sort of multiply the different, again, peripheral perspectives that challenge the hegemony that we're trying to address, whatever that may be.
Kevin, quiero hacerte una pregunta. Bueno, en principio agradecerte la presentación, pero quería, si nos podés dejar si nos podés compartir cuáles son las experiencias a nivel mundial que estás acompañando, que estás reflexionando, investigando. Nosotros y nosotras venimos haciendo un camino con las pedagogías alternativas y las prácticas de los territorios alternativos al capitalismo. Entonces nos interesa conocer cuáles son aquellas prácticas en las cuales estás acompañando o te parece que son interesantes para reflexionar. Luciana Ballestero escribía también y decía, si conocés las experiencias que pasaron en el Foro Social Mundial de Economías Transformadoras, y allí hubo experiencias interesantes, y también, bueno, contarte que nosotros venimos haciendo todo un camino sobre el tema de el monte es un espacio de enseñanza y de aprendizaje, los sabores, los olores, las sensibilidades que existen por fuera de la racionalidad cognitiva.
Kevin, here it is first a quotation of Claudia asked about the word experience that you have. Then Luciana asks you if you know the experiences and methodologies coming from the World Social Forum. And Claudia then said that we, in the University of Good Living, we are trying to develop new methodologies, new didactics, new resources, connected with the feelings, with the colors, with the smells of the things, etc. So other elements that contribute to the education process. And so if you take in consideration all this, also or as a part of your studies or research or not, that is a question, the last question of Claudia.
So I guess to the first part of that, Claudia, yeah, I'm aware of the World Social Forum and the different, again, a lot of De Sousa Santos' work and Epistemologies of the South and others have emerged out of that or in parallel with it. So certainly it's something that is a discourse or a narrative out there that I'm very much aware of. I wouldn't say so much. I think familiarity needs to continue to grow. So the philosophies that I practice are informed from the World Social Forum and beyond. But as I said at the beginning, I'm very intrigued by the practical activities that you and others might be taking, because I continue to think practically toward how do we disrupt capitalism and patriarchy. And so I offered 6 at the end of the presentation, but realized some of the limitations of these practical that we're grounding these in what you and I can do as educators and practitioners. And, I'm not entirely satisfied with the idea that it's our practices and our behaviors that that need to be transformed to contest something like capitalism. So in the practical, for me, it's what I do in my classroom and what I do with my students and toward trying to inform policy. But I'm still interested to learn more from you and others toward what you're doing in your communities to address these issues. So all of this to say, Claudia, that I'm familiar with it, but I wouldn't, I think I would have to rehearse it quite a bit before I were to do something like teach it specifically. A particular aspect of the World Social Forum.
Kevin, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. You're speaking of pedagogy, but precisely the pedagogy is located in a university. And it's interesting what you said, that some Korean educators are now questioning this obsession with metrics, because after all, universities right now are forced to measure themselves against an international ranking system. Personally, I find it very capitalist, because universities are always being ranked according to output. So what alternatives are these Korean educators proposing?
Yeah, so I mean, thank you for your question, because I think it gets at the heart of what I was just trying to say. There is a sentiment among myself and my colleagues to contest some of these metrics. And we have responses to them that are very practical, but how is that really going to change this larger system that we're stuck within? So it's defeating. It can feel very defeatist sometimes. So you Professor Zialcita, specifics that they were talking about. So I think in the Philippines, maybe it's the same as it is here for me in Korea, that SSCI rankings are very much prioritized in terms of our outputs of academic production. So one of the things that we're attempting to do is just to try to think beyond that sort of obsession with that particular metric, SSCI, and to look toward not just open access, but to look toward alternative venues of publishing. So this is one of them that's paramount for us. I think getting beyond also, similarly in this context, a fetish with quantitative.
Yes.
And so thinking of qualitative methodologies or decolonial methodologies that we can use, and making the space to embrace those alternative methodologies. Now, we can do that. You and I and some of my colleagues can do this, but again, we're such a niche, or to use Alejandro's word earlier, peripheral part of the community, what feels defeating sometimes is the peripheral part of the community is accepted as long as it's peripheral. It's not going to get to the core.
That's true.
So I appreciate that there's a space in the institution for me as a qualitative researcher, but I know as well that the boundaries of that space are very rigid.
That's true.
It's a bizarre idea to have in promoting ways to contest the hegemony of the institutional space, but this sort of idea that it's not it's not authentic a challenge. If that
That's true. That's true. That's true. Yes. Over the decades, I noticed universities become more capitalistic, so market-oriented. They act like business companies with heavy emphasis on output. This places a lot of stress on both teachers and students.
Yeah, yes, very much. Yeah. And you know, on that point, I think one of the things that is very much appreciated in this space and in the lab is the emphasis on, as you were speaking earlier, the emotions and the feelings.
Yes.
And you know, the psychosocial appreciation for the students. And I think because they feel that, you know, not that they're not getting it from other faculty members, but because they feel like that's not a norm within the broader system, it really sticks out that they get this type of support. And that speaks a lot toward what it is that we're prioritizing.
Kevin y Fernando, estamos haciendo un relevamiento de universidades de todo el mundo que tengan una concepción popular, y estamos trabajando en un catálogo para conocer experiencias alternativas en todo el mundo, así que quedan invitados e invitadas para conformar el equipo. Nos interesa no solamente la vida académica, sino los espacios educativos que existen en general, en los movimientos sociales, en los grupos sindicales, en el movimiento obrero, campesino.
I translate to Kevin, Claudia, o lo hago en el chat. Well, a few words. Kevin, Claudia said, and I'm going to tell you as well, that in the University of Good Living, we are in this very moment trying to collect all the information about centers or universities that are making this kind of new ways of methodologies, open universities, new ways of interaction in the learning process. And we are making a kind of files on this. So we are very interested if you know about that, and if you want to be part of the group that we are researching on new methodologies and new didactics, where all these issues that you have explained are part of. Traduje tu pregunta, Claudia.
Sí, muchas gracias. Y ya nos estaríamos despidiendo, ¿no?
Sí, sería interesante tenerlos a ambos, desde mi perspectiva. El profesor Fernando me está escuchando y entiende, luego le digo a Kevin, como parte del equipo que investiga, que trata de buscar, porque es lo que están haciendo los dos están buscando nuevas metodologías y nuevas epistemologías, que es lo que estamos haciendo nosotros. ¿De qué manera se quiere? Sí, no sé si lo entendieron, lo digo más claramente.
La invitación es a que sigamos... pero nosotros sí queremos debatir, pero hacemos. Entonces, por eso nos interesa mucho meternos en la vida pragmática, en la vida de la práctica, también de los autores y de la reflexión, pero en la práctica concreta, cuáles son las transformaciones en la que están llevando a cabo.
Sí, Kevin insistió con respecto a eso. Kevin, we are talking about the interest that the University of Good Living has in order to invite you to be part of the research group. Researching what? Methodologies, didactics, new ways of building knowledge, and new ways of practicing the knowledge that you are building. So Claudia reinforced the idea that we are particularly interested in practices. So we make research, but research from the practices. Then we observe the practices and we discuss about them and we try to find the best and take out the worst, of course, in order to make new practices. So in the University of Good Living, we have courses that we are developing practices and trying to make a framework after their practices, creating the framework of the practices that we invite or we select or whatever. And that would be interesting to have both of you. In my case, I have the Culture of Peace Education group.
Oh.
And this is going to be a new, how can I say, new seminar, a new course from more or less September. So it would be very interesting if I can invite both of you to be part of this group. And so we can together plan this course. We can have 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, depends. And I am sure I can do it from September, October, November, for example. No? So it will be interesting if you are part of the research group, but at the same time part of the faculty of this seminar at the Good Living University, if you are interested. Claudia, los estoy invitando a que sean parte del grupo de investigación sobre metodología, sobre construcción epistemológica y sobre todo construcción de teorías a partir de la observación de las prácticas, que fue lo que vos dijiste. Pero también le dije que como íbamos a desarrollar un curso, o está pensado un curso a partir de septiembre, que siempre lo dije, ¿no? Sobre educación para las culturas de paz, si ellos querrían formar parte también. Yeah. Y el profesor Fernando dijo, oh, it seems to me, me pareció que estaba contento.
Es muy interesante. El problema, como siempre, es el tiempo. Tenemos que buscar tiempo.
Claro. Kevin, you understand what Professor Fernando said, that he is very interested, but he have to find the time. And it is always the problem of the time. This seminar is going to develop more or less from September. So you can think that September to December, probably.
Yeah.
And so if you are interested to be part of it, I mean, so, because in general, the seminars in the University of Good Living is shared but by a group of professors. So a group of professors made the curricular design, and they are the coordinators, and they are all the same at the same time.
I see.
In the seminar, so it is quite, how can I say, new in a way. So it is a challenge to develop a new format of seminar.
Yeah, it's better that it's shared. Yeah, it's more alive.
It is.
It's more dynamic, and it's less stressful.
Yeah, that's true.
Less stressful.
But you have to be present always. So it is not 3 days for you, 3 days for the other, and the other. You know how the things are in the other university. You share, but you don't share too much. Él está diciendo, Claudia, que le parece muy bien, sobre todo el hecho de que esté formado un seminario por varios profesores, porque yo expliqué que en la Universidad del Buen Vivir los cursos lo dan varios, que deciden, lo hacen juntos, lo preparan, que no es de uno, sino que de varios profesores, inclusive que invitan a otros a venir. Y él dice que eso es mejor, que se aprende más y que también es más descansado o más relax. Y yo le dije, no tanto, porque los profesores tienen que estar siempre. No es que 3 días uno y 3 días otro y el otro desaparece, sino que están todo el tiempo el equipo. You understand, Kevin, what we are talking about?
Yeah, I understand, Alicia, but I have a question.
Yes.
Who are the participants? Who's the audience for this symposium?
Who are the participants of the University of Good Living, or who are the participants of the seminar that I am talking about?
Well, I would assume that they're the same.
Yeah. Well, we make a general call in Spanish, Portuguese, and English. Usually that are the three languages that the University of Good Living used. And so then we make a general call, and then we have students from everywhere.
Oh.
So there are, yeah. And if we have students in another language, then we have translators. Claudia, ¿qué preguntabas?
No, solo una reflexión final para, digamos, compartir con Fernando y con Kevin que la Universidad del Buen Vivir es una universidad de organizaciones y colectivos organizados en forma comunitaria. No es una universidad basada en expertos académicos, que también lo pueden ser, pero no es la base de la Universidad del Buen Vivir, sino que el objetivo de la Universidad del Buen Vivir y el sustento de su conformación son las organizaciones sociales.
Ah, qué bien.
Sí, ahora lo digo en inglés. Claudia, ¿sabés que sería importante darle a esta gente el PowerPoint en inglés sobre la Universidad del Buen Vivir?
Sí, ya se los pasé, pero lo puedo volver a subir.
We are going to send you the PowerPoint where we explain what is the goals, what are the objectives, what is the methodology of the University of Good Living. So you have a better idea in a way. And now, Claudia, Kevin preguntó quiénes son los profesores y los alumnos de la Universidad del Buen Vivir. Entonces, por eso viene muy bien la explicación que hiciste recién, ¿no? Que ahora la voy a traducir. Kevin, in the University of Good Living, it is not a group of experts in the sense of the Western university. Besides, they are experts because the staff are not individuals, but are organizations. So the University of Good Living born from organizations, and then the organizations have inside experts. And many, many times the natives are the experts, for example. Or a woman is an expert, depends on the, of course, the subject that they have to talk. So it is a kind of groups gathered because they are coming from social organizations, social movements and social organizations. So they are not that comes as individuals. Very many times, some of them are professors in traditional universities, of course, as me and also Professor Fernando and Claudia. But here we develop another way of methodology.
Yeah, I think that's more or less what I expected, Alicia. And so I think I'm getting more of a sense that we're an epistemic community talking to each other. So trying to inform and learn from each other. So when we say students, the reason I was asking was I was trying to understand if what we're doing is we're inviting students from different universities around the world to join these symposia. And so it's kind of the Zoom model that we currently have with open symposia, where there's a very clear sort of expert student sort of relation. That's what I was trying to understand. But I think what I'm hearing from you is it's more of this university in the traditional sense of just a community of scholars who come together to share with each other.
No, it is not that. It is the organizations that share their knowledge. So you don't know if in that organization you have a native or you have an old woman from a very little village that talks about her experiences, or a youth that comes with his problems. related, of course, of the theme that we are developing in that seminar. So it's very interesting because it is very, very heterogeneous. And then you find an expert, and then comes a university professor from Mexico, the F, that it is near the old woman from the village. And they are exchanging knowledge.
Mhm.
So you understand?
I
Estoy
understand.
explicándola. Yeah.
I got you.
It
It's not a university in the sense that university is conceptualized traditionally.
Yeah, yeah. You know, Kevin, we have the problem to name this as university. It is a very deep, it is a very, very deep discussion.
Ahí sí.
Kevin dice, ¿por qué la llaman universidad si no es una universidad, Claudia? Entonces yo le digo, exactamente esa ha sido una discusión que todavía seguimos.
Multiversidad.
Sí, que le pusimos el nombre universidad, pero en realidad no es una universidad en el sentido occidental del término.
Sí, claro.
Claro, pero se las pusimos para pelear justamente con la posición liberal, ¿no es cierto?, de que el saber lo tiene la universidad occidental, blanca,
colonial.
Colonial, capitalista, mercantilizada.
Sí.
Bueno, acá hay dos intervenciones. Alejandro pregunta si tienen el material de la campaña por un currículum global. Después hay una intervención de Carlos Cox, que está escrita en inglés, que está haciendo una pregunta, y Luciana ofrece su libro, y Fernando dice que le interesaría el libro Escoela.
Sí. Todo esto me interesa, porque es muy importante para mi propio trabajo.
Muy bien.
¿Cómo nos quedamos vinculados con ellos,
Ahora
Claudia?
seguimos en diálogos y seguimos por intermedio de correos. Nuestras actividades siguen, pero me creo que ellos tienen que conocer más lo que hacemos, porque es lo que ellos están investigando. Ahora, nosotros no queremos que nos investiguen, sino que trabajen en forma colectiva.
Sí.
So,
por ejemplo, ok, vale.
No, vaya, profesor, pregunte.
He descubierto que allá hay grupo filipino que también ha actuado en cuanto a los derechos de la naturaleza. Se llama Miserior Partnership, algo así. Sería interesante involucrarles porque ya han hecho algo para los derechos de la naturaleza. Sí.
Muy interesante.
Deberían participar en este curso.
¿Usted tiene ese contacto?
No, todavía no. Lo descubrí ayer en YouTube. Entonces voy a buscarles.
Bien.
Muy bien.
Then, Kevin, I ask what are the next steps for Fernando and Kevin? So the next steps is to be in contact with us if you want. And we are going to contact you in order to make this small group if you want to research. And we think, Claudia said that she thinks that the University of Good Living is what you are trying to do. That is what she said, no? What you are trying to do, that we are practicing in a kind of new way of institution, that the name is university, but it is not a university. And then Claudia said that we use the title or the name of university exactly in order to show the Western university model that another university is possible. Another word is possible. This is another university is possible. So that is why we use the same concept and the same word in order to define another concept. You understand the explanation? Is it clear?
Yeah, very clear. It's very clear. Again, it's what I expected. I'm just trying to understand who's usually the sort of participants who engage with the community. But you make it very clear. It's a very heterogeneous group of Sometimes academics, sometimes organizations, sometimes mothers, sometimes farmers, community workers, just a variety of different perspectives that come to address these issues. So it's very clear to me, yeah.
But then, Kevin, you have the commitment to prepare your seminar very well. So you ask all the people that are going to be part of that, let's say, seminar faculty in traditional ways. But then they have to prepare them quite some months before, etc., in order to plan that. So the planning is clear, have to be clear as well. If not, it's a mess. And the mess is when the attendants come, because when the attendants come, really they are very different. So it is a very, how can I say, deep challenge to the professor, that heterogeneity. Te estoy diciendo, Claudia, que la heterogeneidad de los participantes es un verdadero desafío para los profesores de la Universidad del Buen Vivir, porque también le dije, para tranquilizarlo un poco, me parece, que los cursos que se dan o los talleres que se dan están muy preparados durante mucho tiempo por el grupo de profesores, pero que luego no se sabe qué puede suceder por la heterogeneidad de quienes vienen, ¿no?
Lo que quería preguntar es, ¿qué son los resultados? ¿Hay proyectos que hacen los participantes?
Sí. Claudia, ¿quieres contestar eso?
Sí, Fernando, la Universidad del Buen Vivir nació el 24 de enero. La apertura la hizo el profesor Boaventura de Sousa Santos. Así que es una universidad incipiente. Por eso justamente este círculo de diálogo es respecto a las epistemologías decoloniales, para conocer experiencias epistemológicas decoloniales. Nosotros hasta ahora no hicimos ningún curso, son los círculos de diálogo que dialogan con experiencias alternativas al capitalismo, educativas, todas experiencias educativas alternativas al capitalismo. Lo que vamos a hacer para fin de año es una producción colectiva en texto, en formato oral y en formato artístico, porque el año que viene vamos a iniciar un proceso de formación, pero no tiene que ver con expertos académicos, que sí los puede haber, sino con las organizaciones y los movimientos que conforman el colectivo.
Interesante. Sí.
Te mandamos, Fernando, varios enlaces cuando vos nos preguntaste sobre la Universidad del Buen Vivir. Te mandamos también un enlace con la entrevista al colectivo de organizaciones.
Okay.
Claudia, ¿sabes que tendremos que enviarles también la presentación de Boaventura dos Santos en la apertura de la universidad? ¿Esa no está en inglés también?
Eso está, él habló solo en portugués.
En portugués.
Bueno,
sí.
se entiende.
Y está, hicimos la traducción al castellano y hay en una revista, la revista de Economía Social está. Así que seguimos por ahí entonces.
Kevin, we also have to send to you the conference of Professor Boaventura dos Santos in the opening of the University of Good Living in January, because we start in January 2021, no? So we are very young. And that conference was recorded. It is in Portuguese, originally in Portuguese. We can see, I think it is in English as well. Well, I'm going to see it because it's very, very interesting. And he makes the conference, the opening conference. And he is also our consultant all the time, by the way.
I expected he might be. Yeah, I saw his information or a photo on the homepage.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Don't worry about translating it, of course. Just if you send it to me, I can watch it and translate myself.
Okay. So, Claudia, nos despedimos. Alejandro,
Así
¿alguna
es.
otra pregunta?
Gracias, muy bien. Muy bien.
Sí, quería solamente agregar que Bueno, a medida que vayamos dialogando, vamos viendo cuál es la lógica de la universidad. No está separada la producción de la transmisión del conocimiento, digamos que por ahí los círculos de diálogo tienen una razón de ser, una lógica, donde circula, compartimos conocimiento y se produce conocimiento al mismo tiempo. O sea, no hay, por un lado, no hay una división del trabajo ni unidades académicas donde en un espacio sucede una cosa, en otro, digo, entonces por ahí, como uno está muy acostumbrado a una lógica, a una matriz, bueno, hay que ir recorriéndolo el espacio para verlo desde adentro cómo funciona, más que cualquier explicación que uno pueda dar. Y expertos, siempre hay expertos en la medida de que la experticia a la que referimos es el anclaje de las organizaciones, las colectividades, las comunidades, que precisamente tienen un saber, y en este espacio, colectivamente, esos saberes se ponen en diálogo con otros saberes que tenemos otros, somos portadores de otros. Y en esa convergencia es que tratamos de procurar alguna síntesis, ¿no?
Muy bien, muy bien.
Este diálogo continúa mañana a las 12 del mediodía, así que nos vemos ahí.
Ok, vale.
¿A las 12 del mediodía nuestra o de ellos?
Nuestra.
Ah, bueno.
Muy bien.
Bueno, un abrazo, un cariño a todos,
Sí.
y un gusto, muy interesante.
Un abrazo virtual a todos.
Muchas gracias,
Okay.
Fernando.
Gracias,
De
Fernando.
nada.
a todos los
Nos
que nos
veremos.
A ustedes
acompañaron.
también.
Bye, bye,
Gracias.
Kevin.
Goodbye. Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you.
Adiós.
Thank you very much.